Hi, I'm Professor Schreiner, and what I want to do here just for a few moments is I want to take a few moments to introduce myself. The way I want to do this, though, is not to just sit here and drone on and on in front of a webcam. Rather, I want to kind of walk you through a PowerPoint and spice it up a little bit and those types of things. Yeah, it'll make for a little bit better viewing, if you will. So let's go ahead and get this fire. Let's get this fired up. So hashtag Professor Schreiner. This is an introduction of who I am, what I value, a little bit about myself, and I'm also going to give you a little bit about my spiritual journey. Hopefully it will be illuminating, at least from the standpoint of getting to know me a little bit more. 1982. What happened in 1982? What are some of the more prominent landmarks in 1982? Well, Michael Jackson released his album Thriller, which is probably one of his more famous albums. Obviously, the music video is of legend, and actually, interestingly enough, one of the things that people in Lexington, Kentucky, do every year around Halloween is everybody congregates around downtown Lexington. They all dress up like zombies, and they pipe the title track Thriller through these huge loudspeakers, and they actually go through the entire dance from beginning to end, just like you would see in the music video. If you haven't checked out the music video, it's considered one of the best music videos of all time, it's very, very entertaining. So that was one of the things that happened in 1982. The Weather Channel actually started broadcasting in 1982. My dad loves the Weather Channel. When we started having cable growing up, my dad would spend hours and hours just sitting there watching the weather in the evening. I found out later that it helped him unwind. I don't really know why, but it did decompress from the stresses of the day. But I guess when you get older, you start to watch the Weather Channel a little bit more because whenever I'm in a hotel room or anything like that, I find myself just watching the weather. So I don't know if that's necessarily good or bad, but it is what it is. Disney actually opened up the theme park, the Epcot Center, which now people don't even think about, but it was a big deal back in 1982. Why am I going on and on and on about 1982? Well, in 1982, I was born. I was born to Robert and Debbie Schreiner. Dad was a pastor. My mom was a stay-at-home mom for a while there, and then as my two other brothers, as we all got older and we could fend for ourselves a little bit better, mom decided to go back into nursing, and she started doing nursing full time. My two brothers, Aaron, he was born in 1980, and my younger brother, Michael, was born in 1984. So I'm the middle of three. We were all boys. Uh, Honestly, I don't know how my mom made it, but if you ever meet my mom and you would kind of just spend a few moments with her, you could very, very quickly tell that she's very low key, very laid back, and I guess you have to do that if you raise a family of three boys that were all within 4 years apart from each other. So anyway, it made for an interesting day normally in the Shiner household. So some of the highlights of my life: before I graduated high school, I moved 4 times. I lived throughout the state of Ohio, from southeastern Ohio to the foothills, from the foothills of Appalachia all the way up to the northwest corner to the flatlands, where you could see for about miles and miles and miles. Probably, they say the horizon's 13 miles away from you. You could probably see a good 12. So it was nothing but cornfields and bean fields and wheat fields up there in northwest Ohio. I moved 4 times because my dad's a minister, and so I'm intimately aware of the rigors of the pastorate. I know what pastors go through. I know what their families go through, and so my hope for you, if you are a student who finds themselves going towards the pastorate, is that I can kind of give you insight from time to time on what to expect and those types of things if this is a brand new gig for you. I graduated high school in 2000. No, it was 2000. Yeah. I graduated high school in 2000. My graduating class was 70, and that was a big class, which is kind of funny. Many of you are probably chuckling about that, but I was a public school kid too, so it wasn't a small Christian high school thing. No, it was a public school. Weird thing about the schools up in Northwest Ohio, each little town basically has their own high school. I'm sure there's a historical explanation for it, but it makes for some really small high schools and really small graduating classes. But nonetheless, I had a graduating class of 70, and I was one of the bigger classes that Continental High School moved through its doorways in its history. So that's kind of where I come from. I'm very much a product of Northwest Ohio. I was a good kid for the most part. I never really got into big trouble or anything like that. I didn't bring the police home or anything like that. I didn't take any trips home in the cop cars or anything like that. Didn't get arrested. Probably the most mischievous thing I did was steal a bunch of campaign signs. One year during election season, we had a trunk full of campaign signs, probably over 50 of them. And we took them to my track coach's house and decided to stick about 50 plus campaign signs in his front yard. That was pretty much the extent of my mischievousness, I should say. So, yeah, I was a good kid. Never really got into trouble. After high school, I went on to college. I got a BS from Indiana Wesleyan University in biblical literature, a minor in criminal justice. And then about 5 weeks after I graduated college, I moved to Wilmore, Kentucky, where I enrolled in Asbury Theological Seminary. I got a master's degree in biblical studies in the year 2007. And then I was one of the first people to matriculate and graduate from their PhD in biblical studies in 2012. I married Jenny Bramall on July 14th, 2006. She's a school teacher. And when she is not at home raising our two daughters, I have two daughters, Maddox, who's 6, Bailey, who is 3. This is my wife and I. My wife was an All-American cross-country runner when she was at Indiana Wesleyan as well. She also attended Indiana Wesleyan. That year, her freshman year, they finished 3rd in the nation, and they were always like in the top 15 in the nation, even on the quote-unquote down years. But she was an All-American cross-country runner. She ran track. And so one of the weird things that we do as a couple is that we get together and we run 9-mile races in the woods. And this is a picture of us after one of those races, probably up in Indiana somewhere, probably the southern parts of Indiana. You can see the lady in the background there finishing up her race. But that's the weird stuff that we do because we're both active. We like to spend time outdoors and those types of things. These are my two daughters. And that big thing that you see my oldest daughter holding is actually, I believe it's a king snake. And then the half person there is my brother-in-law who teaches biology at Asbury University. And I was gone this weekend, and apparently he decided to have my wife take our daughters over to his office and play with the snakes. So, yeah, that's them. Bailey's right there on the right, and Maddox is right there holding the snake. So a little bit about my spiritual journey. My spiritual journey very much is tied with my history as a pastor's kid. I grew up in church. When your dad's a pastor of small United Methodist churches, basically whenever the church doors are open and there's something going on, you're there, whether it's a church service, Monday, Thursday service, or whether it's a function, funeral dinner, and those types of things. It seems like I was always there, always a part of church in a variety of forms. However, growing up, as I look back on this and I assess where I came from and kind of my spiritual journey, I would say that I was probably more apathetic than anything. I never really questioned God or Christianity. I always thought it was reasonable. I always thought it made sense. But before my latter years of high school, I pretty much didn't really care. It was just kind of like, that was me. I was a pastor's kid. And it didn't really resonate on what that meant and what it meant to be a Christian and the impact that, the way I lived my life had. And then during the latter part of my high school, I started showing more of an interest in the faith, and my faith became a little bit more real, and I started to take things a little bit more seriously. And that apathy that I kind of exhibited during my junior high years and the early high school years, that really started to fall away. And I am indebted to good friends for that time in my life that really pushed me along and challenged me and encouraged me to take my faith more seriously. There was one friend in particular that really had an influence on my life. And so I'm indebted to those people because things started to change. And as I started to take things a little bit more seriously, that spilled over into my college years. And when I was a freshman in college, as I mentioned earlier, I got a minor in criminal justice. The reason I got a minor in criminal justice was because I was going to be a police officer. I was going to be in law enforcement. What I wanted to do when I got into college, I went to one of the few Christian universities in the Midwest that was a good Christian school, but also had a criminal justice department. So that's the reason why I chose Indiana Wesleyan at the time. I played soccer there, but athletics really wasn't that big of an issue. It was the major. But after my freshman year, I had changed majors and I started going towards the more Bible route, more of a Bible route than anything. And so that was that wouldn't have happened if it would not have been for those spiritual influences in my latter years of high school. Um, I don't really have a big conversion experience. I don't can't really look back and say, that's when I became a Christian. As I mentioned, now I always saw myself as a part of the church. I do look back and as I just mentioned, I can point to times and places in my life where I started to take things more seriously, or later on there were some pivotal moments in my life. So I do have those experiences, but I don't have a quote unquote big conversion experience. This is radically different than my dad, who was radically saved and gave up a life of alcoholism and those types of things, pretty much cold turkey. But I don't have that. And ultimately, this is a testimony to my parents of what good parenting can do for your children, giving them the foundation, letting them be the people that they need to be, letting them figure things out when they need to figure those things out, laying down strict expectations when they need to be understood. But my parents allowed me to be who I was, and they allowed me to make the occasional mistake. They were never really overbearing. I certainly knew where they stood. But ultimately, I understood the fruitfulness of their lifestyle, and I eventually adopted it as my own. There are two moments in my life that I point back to as being particularly formative for me. The first was my senior year in college, and it was really interesting because we had a good season my junior year in soccer. We had a lot of people coming back, and I was dating a girl who, at the time, I really thought I was going to marry. We were both Christians. We both were good kids. Didn't get into any trouble, and we started making plans for the future. And I distinctly remember about a month and a half before I went back to college, I was in my room at the time doing some devotions, and I remember praying, God, show me what faith is, and be careful what you pray for, even if you think you understand what you pray for, because God took that moment. I realize now God took that moment and upended my life and turned everything on its head and forced me to come to a new understanding of what faith was. You see, during my senior year in college, things that I thought were good plans were still turned on their heads. And so I was experiencing a lot of spiritual dissonance. The things that I expected to happen weren't coming true, and I was confused and I was angry. And it really, really took a toll on me. And that was probably the time in my life where if I would have been going to a psychiatrist, they probably would have said, you're probably a little bit depressed. And it all stemmed from the fact that what I expected to transpire wasn't transpiring. And so I didn't really know what to do. But I distinctly remember I was fortunate enough during that year to go on a trip. And as I was sailing across the Adriatic Sea on our way to Italy from Greece, I had my Horatio Spafford moment. We were on a small cruise ship, and I walked up on the top deck. It was about midnight because I couldn't sleep. I had a bunch of jet lag. And I remember just being angry and listening to the waves. And I remember the Lord just basically saying, you know what, Dave, it's going to be okay. And that song, It Is Well With My Soul, started going through my head. If you know the story behind Horatio Spafford's hymn, then you know that Horatio Spafford's family was tragically killed in a shipwreck as they were sailing across the Atlantic Ocean. And he later went over to the United States. He took the same route, the same journey. This is the way the story goes. And at the moment when his ship was passing over the place where his family was killed in the shipwreck, the captain came and told him, and because he asked him to do that, and it was at that moment when he was reflecting upon that experience and that tragedy of his life that he penned the words to the hymn, It Is Well With My Soul. And if you ever stop and listen to those, listen to the words of that hymn in relationship to the story behind the words, it really takes on a whole new depth and a whole new power. But that was my Horatio Spafford moment. That was the time where I knew that I wasn't going to have everything figured out. I knew that I was still going to have some confusion, but I started to learn what faith was at that point. I started to realize that while I didn't know everything, God was still the same God that I had been serving for a handful of years now, serving fervently for a handful of years now. And just as he provided for me for all those years, he was going to continue to provide for me, even if I didn't quite understand what was happening and the reasons behind it. that I just need to take a pause. I need to kind of recalibrate my mind and just have faith and realize that God was going to continue to do what he's always done. Then the second moment was at the end of my doctoral work. I matriculated at Asbury Seminary in 2007. That was when the economy was booming and everything was going 900 miles an hour. And then we all know 2008 happened. I remember sitting in a morning meeting in 2008, right after Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, and Ben Witherington said a request. He said, we need to pray for our country because Lehman Brothers just filed for bankruptcy today, and that's going to be a really, really big deal. And I didn't quite understand it at the time. I thought, okay, it's just one other company that went bankrupt. But that was the beginning of 2008, the Great Recession. And one of the things that happened in the academy in the wake of 2008 was that universities and academic institutions started running things differently. So all this meant that the landscape that I thought I was going to go into after I graduated ceased to exist. And that landscape was changing, and institutions were hiring people differently. There were different priorities. Academic institutions are now being run more like a business than an academic institution, which I can understand it. There's pros and cons for it, but that's the reality of it. And what that meant for me was that I didn't have a job, and I had no prospect of a job when I graduated with my degree in 2012. I distinctly remember crying during my graduation because I was scared. I had a wife. I had Maddox at the time. We had one daughter, and I had just spent years of my life and a lot of money on something that I felt called to do, and I still feel called to do. And that never wavered, but I felt called to do, but I had literally no idea what I was going to do with it. I was forced to take a job in the private sector, which I didn't want to do. And it was very humbling. And I don't look back on my graduation from graduate school as a happy time. I don't. A lot of people say you should, but I didn't. It was very difficult for me. It was hard. And to be honest with you, I'm still moving through that. I'm still trying to figure out the lay of the land, and that's been almost 5 years now, since May of 2012. But one of the things that I am beginning to learn is the importance of faith, and what is faith, and what does it mean to have faith in the pursuit of a calling, and then what does it mean to be able to be flexible in that pursuit. A lot of us have ideas of what a calling should be, and we expect, okay, this needs to happen, this needs to happen, this needs to happen. Well, I've come to find out that you need to be flexible in the midst of all of that you can make plans, but you can't hold those plans very tightly, because sometimes things happen, things that we don't necessarily expect, and there's an element of spiritual dissonance that gets introduced into stuff. And if we have a overly rigid understanding of our calling, meaning that we have to do this, this, and this, and we can't do this before we do that, or something along those lines, we're going to find ourselves into some trouble. And there's a very, very good passage in the book of Acts that kind of exemplifies that. And it's really become a passage that has spoken to me on a number of occasions over the past 5 to 10 years. You can read about it in Acts chapter 16, verses 6 through 10. And this is Paul's Macedonian man. And the story goes that Paul was on a missionary journey, and he was desperately trying to get into a particular region. And the text tells us that the Holy Spirit and God was preventing him from entering that region. And just stop and think about that. I mean, think about the confusion. Think about the frustration that you and I would have if we found ourselves on a missionary journey, doing God's work, and yet finding each one of our steps and our efforts, just finding it just ineffective. And that's when Paul gets a vision one night. The text tells us that Paul has a vision of a man who's from Macedonia, and that man is basically saying, hey, Paul, come over here. Don't forget about us. Come see us. And what does the text tell us? Paul gets up the next morning, and he changes his plans. He understands what's happening, and he says, we're not going over here. We're going to go into the region of Macedonia. And as you read through the rest of the book of Acts, you find out that because of Paul's pivot, Paul's understanding of this vision, because Paul understood what God was telling him through this vision, and he decided to be obedient and go to Macedonia. This is where he meets the churches like Ephesus. This is where he meets the churches like Philippi. And those churches are important. Corinth. Those churches are important because attached to those experiences, attached to those missions, are some of the greatest letters in your New Testament. And dare I say that if Paul would not have been obedient, if Paul would not have had that struggle, we can sit here and wonder what our New Testament would have looked like. We can sit here and wonder what New Testament and biblical theology would have looked like, because it's quite possible, we can't verify it, but it's quite possible that our New Testament wouldn't look like that. So this is an example of one of the great heroes of our faith experiencing some spiritual dissonance in relationship to good plans, God-glorifying plans. Remember, Paul was on a missionary journey, desperately trying to spread the gospel. Yet the text tells us that God was actively working against him at that moment in his life because he needed him to go to a different location. So this moment of confusion, this moment of frustration, this moment of spiritual dissonance ultimately produced one of the greatest eras in Paul's life and some of the most fruitful ministries that he ever had. So that's what I want to leave you with, and those are some of the ideas, and so those are some of the points that I have kind of come to grasp and come to understand over the past few years. And as I said, it's those two moments and those two phases in my life have been very, very formative. And so I leave that with you, and I leave that with you. And when we encounter times of spiritual dissonance, let's take a step back and let's ask God, okay, God, let's be flexible, let's be malleable, and let's not hold to our plans rigidly, because sometimes our plans aren't, no matter how good they are, aren't what needs to be done.